I think in common conversation, this phrase, being diplomatic, is used a lot. And I think it appears to me as sort of striking a balance between two different objectives. And so I wanted to know, how would you define that phrase?
What is diplomacy? The art and the practice of building and maintaining relationships and negotiating between states, nations, people. And I think normally people, in the normal parlance, people use the word diplomacy to suggest some tact, some mutual respect. But there are many tools. Those are all tools of diplomacy. I mean, there are many tools. You can even use the threat of force, for instance. But once you cross over into actually using force, I think that's where diplomacy at least takes a side seat or back seat. And so I suppose one would have to add peacefully somewhere in that definition. The art of peacefully building and managing relationships and negotiating between states and nations and people even. I mean, today it's no longer just states who conduct diplomacy.
Sir, I thought we could do something. Like, you've had so many roles as foreign secretary, as ambassador, and so on. And if you could take us into one of the assignments you were given, one of those assignments that stick clearly in your mind, and I think an assignment that clearly captures this art of, tussle and finding this balance.
Well, yeah, in 97, when Sri Lanka was in the middle of her civil war, ethnic civil war, with the Tamil Tigers, fighting against the Colombo government, I was sent to Sri Lanka. And I was told as India, we had two objectives. One was, because of the sensitivity of the Tamil issue within India also, after all, there were over 60 million Tamils in India, that we have to see whether we can't bring this to a peaceful conclusion. But on the other hand, we also wanted to maintain our relationship with Sri Lanka and the government of Sri Lanka, which was essentially a Sinhala government, partly because of Sri Lanka's strategic position. It's an unsinkable aircraft carrier 14 nautical miles off our coast. So these are really contradictory in some ways. In other ways, they're not. But you end up, therefore, negotiating both sets of objectives at the same time. And it's not always easy. The one way we found was to negotiate a free trade agreement between us and Sri Lanka, which we did between 97 and 2000. And successive governments. The Gujarat government started it, the Vajpayee government signed it finally. But it took some hard work, both on our side. I think there was as much negotiation within India as there was with the Sri Lankans. But when you say contradictory impulses, this is the way the world is. The world is a messy place. It's never the simple stuff of textbooks, which says, here's your goal, go out and get it, negotiate, get it. So diplomacy in that sense is a sort of mini-max. You minimize harm, you maximize gain. But you also have to think of the other side, because frankly, you might win everything if you want. But then the other side has no incentive to implement what you've agreed. Like Versailles is a good example of a treaty which was imposed by the winners. They got everything they wanted. But the defeated then spent all their effort the next years and a whole world war to try and undo it. So you have to think not just about winning for yourself, but giving the other side enough to have an incentive to implement what you want done. So it gets pretty complicated, but that's the joy of it, right?
I mean, in those two examples, I want to stick with that. Would you say that the seeds of World War II was sowed in the chokehold that they got Germany in after the Treaty of Versailles?
Well, you could argue, there are many explanations. I think part of it was Versailles, that the form in which it came was because of Versailles and but it was also, built into the European situation. The German problem has been a problem in Europe for a long, long time. And they tried various ways of dealing with it. The Holy Roman Empire, for instance, was one way of dealing with it. But the whole issue of, Germany has no natural frontiers, in a sense. So once Germany is unified, becomes a powerful state at the heart of Europe, then what about everybody else? Everybody else feels threatened. And so you could look for much deeper causes than just Versailles. But as a proximate cause and the form in which the reaction came, I think, yes, Versailles would have to take some of the blame.
And with Sri Lanka, so I mean, in that, how did India decide its priorities? I can't imagine that it was just like one leader at the top who was setting out all these objectives. So when this ethnic civil war was happening, how did we decide what we wanted, and then how did we go forward and tell them this is what we want out of this?
Well, it's been a long-standing problem in Sri Lanka, and it took many years to reach its most acute form of a civil war. But right from the 50s, when under SWRD Bandaranaike, Sri Lanka decided to make Sinhala the national language. And when slowly Tamil was relegated, Tamils saw themselves losing their position in society. They had been among the most educated and the most active. And then once majoritarian rule came in, then the Sinhala interest prevailed. So it had been building. And it first took the resistance, Tamil resistance took the form of democratic movements, political parties, but it became increasingly radicalized. The less they got after 83, after the program in July 83, it became armed and militant. And you had a whole host of militant groups, and you had refugees in India, a large number of refugees. So Indian policy evolved in response to those situations. But two or three things stayed constant right through. One was the idea that Tamil rights should somehow be respected and guaranteed, but within the framework of a united Sri Lanka. Because balkanization was not either in Sri Lanka's interest and certainly not in India's interest. Don't forget that through the feast, there was a very strong Dravidian sentiment in Tamil Nadu, for instance, and there was this fear of separatism spreading into India itself. After all, we were still building the nation state at that stage. So Indian policy evolved, but the fundamentals of that policy, and that this should be done peacefully within Sri Lanka democratically, that would be our preference, and we would help to create an environment in which Sri Lanka's unity and the rights of all Sri Lankans, including the Tamils, would be respected. That those basic imperatives, those stayed constant right through. So it's a series of individual decisions which add up to a larger policy, which then we're self-conscious enough to understand what we're doing. But it doesn't present itself as, okay, here's your big moment of choice. What are you going to do about Sri Lanka? It presents itself in bits and pieces. What are you going to do about the program? What are you going to do about the refugees? What are you going to do when Jaffna is blockaded? Are you going to intervene or not? Will you do the Paripu drop? Will you drop food supplies to Jaffna? Will you then work with the Sri Lankan government to find a solution that works for the Tamils within a federal structure with devolution of powers under the 13th Amendment? So at each stage, but they add up to one consistent policy overall.
Professor, would you say in that particular scenario that our main objective was maintaining internal stability and avoiding like Tamil Nadu seceding as its own state, or
I
what I'm trying to...
more than that, I think it's also that was an element certainly at the beginning. But I think by the 80s, when the problem really became acute in Sri Lanka, the idea of separatism and so on in Tamil Nadu, I think, had gone. It's interesting, if you look at Periyar's first speech in Parliament in April 1962, he still talks of Dravidian identity and separatism. He hints at separatism. The moment the Chinese attack, over 1962, he is swearing loyalty to the Union. And after that, there's no mention of separatism. And that's Periyar himself. If you look at it, I mean, I don't think that was the main driving force of Indian policy by the 80s onwards, late 70s, 80s. By then, I think it was more about a peaceful periphery, free of outside hostile antagonistic interests. And therefore, I think it was a question of working with Sri Lanka to keep the peace and to get the Tamils their rights.
So, I mean, the reason I ask this is I would like to believe that countries, ours and even otherwise, have like humanitarian reasons for devising their foreign policy. But I'm trying to understand, is that the main reason, or is there always some incentive like for us to avoid violence in our own country? Like what dictates
humanitarian reasons make for good policy. It's like honesty is a good policy, right? And because supposing you didn't support the humanitarian cause of the Tamils in Sri Lanka, if you hadn't done anything, how would your Tamils react? Badly. And obviously that will have political consequences for you when you come to your elections and your time you're dealing with it in India. So my argument is that actually being ethical, being humanitarian, it does influence policy because it's good policy, because it's in your self-interest to be seen as humanitarian, to be seen as ethical. But it's not always the prime motivator or the sole cause. And there is a risk here. Many countries present themselves, we also very often present themselves as being morally driven and humanitarian and working for good, etc., and morally superior in some ways. I mean, the Americans keep talking of democracy. And yet, when their interests demand it, they're quite happy to work with dictators, with whoever, with any regime of any kind. And that gap between what you say and what you do, if it gets too big, you get accused of hypocrisy. And in our case, for instance, all governments of India, doesn't matter what shade of political opinion they are, all governments of India have dealt with whoever's in power in our neighborhood. Doesn't mean they've always liked them, doesn't mean they're always democratic or they're like us, but they've dealt with them in practice because that's sensible policy. It's our own neighborhood, right? It's going to affect us. Every one of our borders is porous. So there is a gap between the way we present foreign policy and the actual practice of it. But the trick, I think, is to make sure that that gap today is as small as possible if you want to maintain your credibility. And credibility is critical for a diplomat because most of the time, he's not holding a gun to somebody's head and coercing him into doing things. He might use the threat of coercion. It might be implicit in the power relationship, etc. But basically, he's relying on his credibility. And that is crucial. And that's where, as you said, humanitarian and other considerations come in.
I've heard you say this in a couple of interviews, this idea of credibility. So I do wonder, on Sri Lanka first, do you think that was one of your hardest assignments in all your roles, foreign secretary, ambassador, national security advisor? What would you say was the hardest role?
I don't know about hardest. Frankly, I enjoyed all my jobs. I mean, they were challenging. Yeah, they weren't easy, but that was what made them interesting. Yeah, I mean, what's life without a little spice, right? I find it hard to say which is harder or easier. They were all different, but each one was interesting in its own way. I was lucky.
I'm trying to imagine what the weight of responsibility must have felt like. If I had to picture myself in your role, like I was responsible for so many people who I would never meet. Like, did you ever feel overwhelmed at times?
You have to keep telling yourself that it's not personal. This is work. It's not you. It's a job, right? And you do it to the best of your ability. And you know that you will make mistakes. You know that you're not perfect. You accept that. But you try and fix them. And you try. What can you do about that? It's a job. You have to do it. You do it to the best of your ability. But you make sure that you at least introspect regularly about whether you're doing it right or not. And you try and fix whatever you see as having gone wrong and so on. But you have to remember, it's not you. You are not your job. It's nothing to do with you. It's a job that you have to do, and if you can, you do it well. If you try your best. But if you let the weight of it sit on your shoulder and, I think the stress would probably get you. But also, I think it would affect your ability to do the job well. I mean, you need to maintain a certain objectivity, a certain capacity for actually looking at what you're doing and evaluating it. And that, I think, is essential at that level.
In
The foreign service is not bad, actually, because, in the foreign service, posts are not attached to rank. So you don't post ambassadors depending on what their rank is. You post them according to who's good for that job. So in that sense, it helps.
Right. Wow. And how did you delegate responsibility? Say, even we could stick with this example, the Sri Lankan one, or even otherwise. What would be how would you delegate?
It's not, everything is not on your shoulders. I mean, there's a whole group of people who are working. When we were doing the FTA, for instance, I think a lot of the really hard work was done in Delhi by people in Commerce Ministry, in MEA. I mean, and we handled some of the negotiations with the Sri Lankans, and Sri Lankan opinion we handled in the High Commission. But the people in Delhi had to deal with interests in India who felt they'd be affected by a free trade agreement. They had to deal with the political environment in which this was actually new, the idea of a free trade agreement with a neighbor. And so it's not as though you're carrying all the load. You're working with people. And I was fortunate. I had a mission which had people who were really good and who did most of the work.
Okay, so I mean, okay, we were talking about Indian foreign policy. Would you say that it's remained roughly consistent with that non-aligned agenda, staying sort of being diplomatic in sort of steering a
I
balance?
think the word that I prefer using is strategic autonomy. But the reason, and whether you call it non-alignment, Janata Party used to call it genuine non-alignment, different people have used different words, multi-directional or all kinds of things, omnivalent, whatever. Why is this a steady thread right through all the governments, no matter who leads it or where they are on the political spectrum? Because India is unique. Can you think of another country at our level of development, with our geography, history, with the same set of interests as us? No. So there is a strong case for Indian exceptionalism, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that you can go off and live in your own world, cut yourself off from everybody, because you need the world for energy, you need the world for technology, you need the world for capital. If you want to transform India, develop India, you need the world. You can't do it alone, because you can't just wallow in your own little pond. You need to work with the rest of the world. So you will have to engage. So you are in this, and this has been true through history. If you look at history, those parts of India which were most connected to the world are the parts that did best, that were the most prosperous, most developed, most advanced, which accounted for India producing 25% of the world's industrial product in 1750. But which were those parts? It was Gujarat, Malabar coast, the Coromandel coast, and Vanga in the larger sense. So these were the parts that were connected to the rest of the world, which actually produced what you did, and which were the most prosperous and the most advanced. So, to my mind, strategic autonomy makes sense. You will follow your own path, and whether you call it non-alignment, you will judge issues based on your self-interest. But you will also have to work with the others, with the rest of the world. You can't disengage. You can't say, I'm a world unto myself, I can take care of myself, and I don't need the rest of the world. You can't disengage. So you will engage. And when the international multilateral system is working in the 50s, early 60s, you engage with that, you use that. Later, you work with the sole superpower, with the US. You transform your relationship with the US. You work with the Soviet Union, with Russia, its successor state. You work with whoever you can, the EU. Your goal throughout, because of what your levels of development has consistently been to transform India, and that's still your goal. You might put it differently. Different people will say Viksit Bharat. Rajiv Gandhi used to say prepare India for the 21st century. The idea was the same. It was, how do we transform India from being a country with so many poor people, where there's still hunger, sickness, etc., into a modern, prosperous, secure country, right? So if that's your goal, you can't do it without the world. But
Wow.
you are unique. So yes, this is why strategic autonomy is where we end up.
So in some ways, I find some foreign policy moves a little contradictory. Like, I'll give you an example. With China, there are often border disputes that happen in the Himalayas. But we are also part of BRICS, and we have this sort of economic alliance, if I could call it that. And so how do we juggle both?
Yeah, but she is your biggest trading partner. most years in the last decade. And you still have a difficult political relationship, which is even more difficult now. Actually, it's in an impasse since Galwan, since 2020, the clashes. So, yes, you're absolutely right. That's what diplomacy is about trying to deal with these differences. But it's not that we've created these contradictions. They exist. I mean, let's face it. That's the way the world is. The world is not necessarily a logical, rational, simple place where everything falls into place and makes rational sense. Yes, there will be contradictions, but that's fine. That's why we negotiate. That's why we have diplomacy. That's why we try and understand the world, and we proceed on the basis of our understanding of the world and keep changing and improving that depending on what we see happening around us.
So I want to pick up on something that you said about, I think 2024 was the year of elections. I believe that's what they call it, because there were so many across. And I think people sometimes think that foreign policy is the sole prerogative of the person elected. But I'm sure it's more complicated like that. Like, how much of diplomacy is personal?
It started as the relationship between rulers, and once you had the idea of absolute sovereignty, which is, historically speaking, a relatively modern idea. I mean, it started with Westphalia, the idea that sovereigns controlled their own territory and that sovereignty is absolute, that you have hard boundaries, that what you do within the boundary is your business. You don't interfere in each other's internal affairs. This is really a 17th century idea, European idea, which has now been exported to the rest of the world. Once you got that, then diplomacy became between sovereigns, and ambassadors really were one sovereign's ambassador to another. Yes, it was highly personal. But over time, it has become less and less personal as power gets distributed in societies, and decision-making also then gets distributed. Certainly in democratic societies, you can't do diplomacy just with the leader. You have to deal then with the legislature, with public opinion, which then affects the leaders. At one level, yes, it is still between individuals at one level, because the ultimate business of negotiation is done by individuals. So it is a people business. But there are many more actors. Now there's non-state actors involved. Now you look at the power that, certain corporations have, that they bring to the table. It's huge. So when they hold an AI summit in Paris, as they're doing today, co-hosted by India and France, you have to invite the corporations to the table. You have to invite intergovernmental organizations to the table. And you have the public also expressing their views outside, because of so much of what happens, and when they're discussing AI, for instance, so much of what's happening is outside the control of the state. States can't determine this. States are still trying to figure out how to deal with it. So it's become less and less personal in that sense, in the sense of how many things affect diplomacy. But the final process of negotiation is still ultimately between individuals. And there's no getting away from that.
I think this is a good segue to talk about one of those landmark moments in Indian foreign policy, the Indo-US nuclear deal, which you were a part of. What are the key discussions at that point in time?
I came late to it, by the way. Because the deal was actually done in 5, and Shyam Saran was the foreign secretary. Shyam Saran, Raman Sen was ambassador in the US. And when Dr. Manmohan Singh went and visited President Bush in 2005, July, so the outlines of the deal were done then. And then it was a question of working it out, of seeing whether we could actually not just get agreement internally in the US and in India, but also get the international organizations, the IAEA, and whether we could reduce it to a bilateral agreement. So I came into it only in 2006, when we got to the stage of negotiating a bilateral agreement with the US, the 123, and when we had to get IAEA approval for a safeguards agreement, for the other things, and get the NSG to approve it before we could do all the steps. So I was really involved in those, but I think the real credit for the basic decisions has to be given to Dr. Manmohan Singh and those in 2005 who took the big courageous decision to go down that path and see what we could achieve.
How did we balance and or rather tell people like non-proliferation advocates, how did we manage their interests along with pursuing this
Well, I think
agenda?
our record spoke for itself because we had, it's interesting in the 70s when we were economically in much worse shape and when we faced the first oil shock in 73 and then again in 79. Two or three of the oil states, Gaddafi, for instance, of Libya, had actually threatened us, demanding that we share nuclear technology, enabling him to make weapons, or he would cut off oil supplies and stop our projects and so on. But we had refused to, even when, the incentives, unlike, Pakistan and other states who went around selling it, we didn't fall for that at all. And our record, I think, spoke for itself. We had developed our own technology. We'd broken no agreements right through. And we had never made a secret of what we were doing. We didn't sign the NPT because we weren't going to break our word. And I think that was the big difference. So our perfect non-proliferation record actually spoke for itself and answered most of the non-proliferation critics. Now, there were those who said it set a very bad example to other people. But frankly, there was nobody else in our position. Nobody else who was like us, who was actually using nuclear energy and technology developed by ourselves for our own people, to generate power, to irradiate seeds, to do various other things. So in that sense, it was easier to deal with the non-proliferation argument. But there was a political argument, which was much harder to sort out, because politics is, not necessarily always rational. And the argument was simple, was that you are tying India to the US, and the US is not a friendly power. How can you trust the US? My answer to that used to be, you don't have to trust the US. Do you trust the US to follow their self-interest? If you do, make it in their interest to implement this agreement. Write an agreement which gives them an interest as much as you in it being implemented. And if you do that, then you're safe, relatively, as safe as you can be in the international system. So, and I think what helped was that the agreement clearly would help you, one, for nuclear power, so to help you with your energy needs, but also it was a clean form of energy at a time when, climate crisis, when you would, after Rio and so on, you were talking now, you were beginning to understand the effects of climate change, of environmental change, actually. And here was a form of energy which could meet your needs, but also promised to be relatively free of environmental effects. So all in all, it took some argument. Ultimately, it took even a confidence motion in Parliament. I think ultimately we came out on the right side.
Could you take us into those conversations? Like there is that one famous image with you and Tom Donilon and even President Obama for a bit. I believe he had just entered the room. And so, like, what are those conversations you're having? Because people like us sitting on the outside don't know what goes on in those rooms.
Well, we talk about whatever's interesting us. That one that you're talking about when Tom Donilon, that was when Egypt was, Tahrir Square was going on, when the Arab Spring had just started. So we did our bilateral business very quickly, but we were all very interested in what was going on in West Asia, and especially in Egypt, because this was where it really caught fire after Tunisia, where the Arab Spring was going on. So a lot of that conversation was, so you would always talk about your bilateral business, what concerned you and what you wanted, and they would talk about what they would want. But we would also talk about what was going on around the world and what was going to affect us, where we thought it was going. So it really depends what time, when we were having those conversations. But if you look at India-US relations, again, it's been a fairly steady process from the late 90s of transformation, of improving. from the Vajpayee government onwards. And if you look at the leaders on both sides, you've had all kinds of leaders on both sides. You can't think of a wider range of personalities than the leaders in India and the US from the year 2000 onwards. And yet the progress in that relationship has been steady, the improvement. So to go back to your earlier question, how much is personalities? Yes, personalities matter. We would never have done the civil nuclear agreement without Dr. Manmohan Singh and President Bush, because they were the ones who held firm and saw it through politically. But at the same time, you have to accept that there is a larger context which also drives these relations.
So working with all these leaders, Dr. Manmohan Singh, Vajpayee, even interacting with President Obama and so on, what did you learn about leadership from them? Like, I've never interacted with any of them, and so I don't know.
I don't know about leadership, but it's interesting that at that level, one thing most of them have in common is an ability to not just to listen, but to also to seek out bad news. That they want to know what's going on out there, because they know that the higher you go, the more remote you are from reality. And they want to know what's going on. And that I found, I was quite amazed. The other thing that they all have in common is an ability to concentrate on the moment. I mean, they might have 25,000 things that bother them. I remember we were doing civil nuclear with President Bush when TARP was going on, when Lehman Brothers had crashed, when, 2008, the global financial crisis. And yet, when he was talking to us about civil nuclear, he was totally focused on that. And he had this ability. Of course, he stepped out of the room and went back into that. And this is common to most of them, the ability to focus on what they are doing at that moment. And I think it's essential, because otherwise, as you said earlier, they just get overwhelmed by so many things. And what do they do now? But that is common to all of them.
So in these negotiations, I wouldn't imagine, I'm sure that everyone comes with an agenda. And so I can imagine myself over-analyzing what the other person is saying, because I know they have an agenda behind what they're saying.
But he knows you have an agenda. So he knows that you know, and he knows. I mean, this goes back and forth forever. Ultimately, a negotiation goes through 3 phases, right? First is a phase of discovery, when you actually lay out your positions and you try and get the other person to understand why you are doing certain things. That's really the beginning, the first phase. And that's a phase when people tend to exaggerate their demands it's like any normal, you're actually negotiating all the time in daily life. Then you get to the middle phase, which is where you try and establish what his real bottom lines are. But neither side has an interest in revealing that, because, as I said, you're trying to maximize your gain, minimize his. But you leave him enough to, right? And then the end phase, when once you think you know, you may not know, and he thinks he knows, and you get to the end phase where you actually clinch the deal, where you actually have to come to knowing when you're transitioning from one to the other. And this is why you have professionals doing this. And when you're comfortable with each other and you trust the other, this is why I say credibility is so important. When somebody tells you that, okay, this is it, now let's move on, what do you think is the shape of a final deal? You have to be willing then to... So diplomacy, as Raymond Aron used to say, diplomats are gamblers. Because you don't know ultimately what's in his mind. But you're guessing, and you take a leap, thinking I might be able to achieve this, I might be able to do this. But he's also taking a leap into the unknown. And I have a theory that goes with this, actually. If you look, the more risky a profession, the more you deal with risk, the more conservative they are in their clothing. The most risky is the army. They wear a uniform. But bankers wear suits and ties. He's fiddling with your money, by the way. He's taking risks with your money. Diplomats also, very conservative, very careful.
And with it being an uneven playing field, do you know whether you're going in with being the person on, like, the underdog or the person on the back foot, or is it you go in with the front foot and try to get what you want?
As Mao had a phrase about converting weakness into strength. And in some ways, that's true. If you're weak, there's only so much you can give. And if your back is against the wall, you'll fight like a tiger. I mean, if it's a matter of survival, of life and death, then you will actually really, and he knows it also. He knows the limits of, if it's a matter of life and death for you, he will try and get what he can out of it. But it's not just the power, relative balance of power that determines the outcome. It doesn't mean that because the US has preponderant power, had for a long time, she won everything. No. Or that she won every negotiation. No, other people have agency too. And there are various forms of agency in the system. And not all of it is just straight hard power agency. It's also utility to the other of what you can offer. And some things, it's a complicated calculus actually. So there's one thing you learn is that there's always room for negotiation, that you always have some leverage, some agency. But how much and so on that's what the process of negotiation establishes, right? When you go through the beginning, the middle, before you get to the end.
Like, did you get trained in this? Like, do diplomats undergo some sort of negotiation training?
We're trained, and some of it you learn on the job. You learn by watching, by participating, by, when you're young, and you learn by reading and other people's experiences. But a lot of it is, yes, it's, in our case, we were not a big foreign service. I mean, we're growing now. We were very small. When I joined, there were 450 of us, diplomats, and everybody knew everybody. And you therefore ended up being exposed very early to a lot of things and to big negotiations very young. You couldn't. And people were quite happy to teach you and to tell you what they thought they were doing and why they were doing it and so on. Yeah, I mean, but a lot of it is on the job and is through experience rather than, but yes, we are trained. I mean, they spent 2 years training us, and some of it is about how to negotiate, how negotiations work. But you need to have some experience in order to make sense of what you're being told, right?
Do these negotiations happen in like boardrooms, or is it informal spaces? Like,
There's
if
a
it's
formal
personal.
process of training, of course, where we are taught about negotiation, and former diplomats come to us when we're probationers and teach us, and so do academics. And so on. There is a formal process of training, but yeah, the rest, a lot of it is informal and anecdotal. And one of the first jobs you're given is to sit and take notes and keep the records of negotiation. And one of my first jobs was when the Pakistani foreign minister came in April 74, Aziz Ahmad, and he was negotiating with Haksa, and we were still holding 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war. It was just after the war. And they hadn't recognized Bangladesh. And so one of my first jobs was to just sit there and take notes of what was going on and produce a record at the end of it. And obviously, after each round, the delegation would sit and talk about what had happened and what we thought was happening and where we were going and whether we could achieve things or not. So you learn on the job as well.
Did you have some key influences, people who, I know your family has been involved in this, and so who were those? Yeah.
The family had very little to do with it because, by the time I joined the Foreign Service, only my father was in it. And 4 years later, he died. So I had no idea what I was getting into when I got into the Foreign Service. But certainly you learned from mentors, from people you worked with.
Who were they? Who are these people? Like, if you had to name some of them.
It's a long list. My first ambassador was K.R. Narayanan in China. Brajesh Mishra, Dikshit. I mean, there's a whole host of people who I learned from.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about soft diplomacy and soft power. Could you break that down, those terms?
I am not a great believer in soft power and soft diplomacy.
Lovely.
Maybe temperamentally, Venkateshwar, who used to be Foreign Secretary, he used to say it's a law of optics that the image can never be better than the reality. And I do believe that, yes, it's a whole industry now, spinning, sending out, creating narratives and discourse. But this is all one remove from reality. And ultimately, diplomacy, or most political activity, should be about creating outcomes, not about creating impressions or perspectives or narratives or discourses. That's talking about talking. If you can change people's perceptions and lead them to creating the right outcomes that you want. But for me, the important thing is the outcome. That's what. So it's when people say, when I say that the goal of Indian diplomacy is to create an enabling environment for the transformation of India. It's not to make India great in the world, to make India a great power, to have the world recognize our status, for us to be the teachers of the world. That's not our job. Our job is to improve the welfare of our people, and that can be measured very simply. And once you define your job as outcomes, then soft power is useful, a tool which you use to create those outcomes, rather than a goal in itself, which it tends to become. Because there's a whole industry that goes with it. I mean, China spends something like $26 billion just on the television that she projects abroad, CGTN. And yet, look at China's image.
On China, actually, since
So, I mean, for me, look at the US. I mean, what are the most successful US exports, cultural exports?
democracy.
No, rock and roll,
Okay.
Coca-Cola, blue jeans. These are all symbols of rebellion.
That's right.
These are not symbols of the state. This is not the state projecting power. And people wear blue jeans and protest against America quite happily, right? So what happened? This wonderful soft power. I mean, we are great exporters of Bollywood and Indian music. People do Bollywood dances across the world. Does that translate into outcomes that really help India? I mean, that's the issue. So for me, yes, soft power exists. It's useful. It's a big industry. So there's lives and careers to be made in it. But ultimately, its ultimate utility should be measured by how much it helps you to create the right outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think? Tell me what you think.
I mean,
Because you're the generation brought up in postmodern terms, right? Narrative, discourse, all this is a big part of your vocabulary.
I mean, the reason at least I asked that is because the US consulate had invited me last year to talk about some environmental activism work that I did. And that's when I heard the term. I asked them, like, why did you want to talk to me? And soft power came up in that conversation. And it made me wonder, like, what is my role in this broader space? I mean, on Bollywood, I actually never thought of Bollywood as an Indian export, but I would assume that it builds some goodwill in terms of, like, I can imagine myself going to another country and someone saying, "Hey, you're an Indian, you must like Bollywood," and that sort of connection building. On China, since you had mentioned China,
Mm-hmm.
how do you think China has changed from the time that you were ambassador over there?
Yeah. Some things remain, I think, are common. Some of China's drive to be a great power to avenge what they regard as a century of humiliation. I think that's been common to Mao, Deng, Xi Jinping's China across the board. I don't think that has changed very much. But how they go about their business has certainly changed. China, especially because China seems to operate on their perception of the relative balance of power. So long as they were convinced that they still had a long way to go to catch up with the US, they worked very well with the US from the Nixon visit from 71 onwards, all the way until 2008. When the global financial crisis, I think, convinced them that the balance had shifted, that the West, and the US especially, was in terminal decline, and that their moment had come. So they started behaving very differently, and you've seen the result in China-US rivalry. So for me, it's not so much that China's goals have changed, fundamental goals. Just like in the Indian case, our fundamental goals remain the same. How we go about it changes depending on our understanding of the situation and the means that we have available, which in the Chinese case means the relative balance of power, how they understand that. And the more powerful they feel, the more assertive, the more they go out and push for their interests. Otherwise, they postpone the attainment of those interests.
How do you see it changing in the next 10 years, like this balance of global powers? And where does India feature in that?
It depends on, frankly, China's trajectory, but also the trajectory of the rest of the world. I'd be very careful about predicting anything for the next 10 years or so. I think foreseeable future is really about now down to about a year and a half, two max. More than that, I'd be very careful.
Okay.
Because China's own trajectory is also a big question mark. Despite all the confidence that the Chinese express, their economy is slowing, and they do need to find a new model, a new growth engine. And this transition to domestic consumption doesn't seem to be happening. If anything, they're exporting more than ever before. Almost $1 trillion last year was their surplus. That's a lot.
Do you think India is, I think the word often used with India is a geopolitical counterweight. At least that's the way they describe India to, various powers, whichever one you can choose. And I wanted to understand if that term makes sense.
I'm not sure that it makes sense. That's not really the way I choose to. Because our job is to follow our interests, not to serve somebody else's interest of being a counterweight or a balancer. If it's in your interest to be a counterweight, then be so. But I don't see how that is at your present stage. I think it's in your interest actually because you are not the strongest power on the block. Therefore, have an interest, and because of the way you are structured, what you need for your own development, your own future is you need to be able to work with everybody. Your two biggest trading partners are China and the US. They might fight among themselves, but you can't, as I keep saying, putti is not policy. You cannot say, I won't talk to you, I won't talk to the other person.
God, Ashoka.
I think you're frozen again.
Yeah. It's Ashoka, sir. I sometimes.
As I was saying, you can't say that I won't talk to either of them because they're fighting, or I'll pick one side over the other. On issues, yes, one side might be right or the other, but otherwise, you're not going to alienate them. Your interest today is in working with as broad a coalition as possible. And on different issues, you'll find different people to work with.
Okay. So, we're reaching the end. But I do have some questions that I went and asked your students, and they wanted to ask you these without like them, knowing that it's them. And you can choose to rapid fire, or you can choose to take them.
Let's wrap it.
All right. What is the best advice you received while working in government, and who was it from?
Well, when I got in the Foreign Service, I was very nervous. I said, I went to my father and said, what do I do? I know nothing about this job. And he said, don't worry, just remember one thing. Whoever you're dealing with, president, chauffeur, whatever, they're all human.
Oh, lovely. Okay, very nice. If you had to advise some young person who was interested in diplomacy, what are some realities that they should know of?
Well, they should always remember what is our basic interest and what is important. And you prioritize things depending on how it helps India to develop and become the India that you want. And depending on that, prioritize it and then chase those interests. And that's your basic job.
Building on that, what would be the essential qualities of a good diplomat?
Well, as I said, it varies. All kinds make good diplomats. As long as they have, as I said, credibility, to understanding. They must be able to empathize with other people and understand where other people are coming from. That's very hard, actually. It's very easy to project your own interests, ideas, values, etc. onto other people. Expect them to behave the way you do. They don't. those two things I think are essential. Whether you're gregarious or, introvert, all that it doesn't matter very much.
I think some of them wanted me to ask you to pitch the subject of IR, not even just Ashoka's IR department, but like what makes an IR person's understanding of the world different from, say, someone who hasn't studied IR and those theories?
I would say that IR
So IR
offers you more than just one discipline's point of view. So rather than narrowing your focus, it actually broadens it. Because in IR, you need to know your history, you need to know your politics, you need to know your economics, you need to know your geography for geopolitics. There isn't much that you need to know some science and technology, whether it's energy security. So IR actually broadens your vision and enables. So I would suggest doing a discipline well and then moving on to IR.
Okay, so you can be specialized in the international relations of that particular.
Of whatever. No, you can then branch out and you broaden your thinking.
What was one diplomatic effort that you were part of that didn't go as well as planned? And like, what did you learn from that?
Well, we haven't settled the border boundary with China.
Yeah.
And it certainly hasn't gone as anyone planned, I think, as either the Chinese or us. And let's see. I mean, what I learned was a little bit of humility.
Right. Okay. What is the strangest or most unexpected place you had to conduct some sort of diplomatic interaction?
Well, I had to negotiate it in Xinjiang. I was with Ambassador Narayan and translating for him in a Kazakh tent, in a yurt, where they brought in this half-cooked little baby lamb and offered him the eye and said, "This is a special thing." And he said to me, "Shankar, I've never doubted your Chinese, but are you sure I'm supposed to eat this?" And I was so happy he was ambassador and I wasn't.
I don't envy him.
But that was a hard negotiation with him.
I can imagine. I mean, I guess this sort of answers this question, but if you have another one, has humor ever featured in these diplomatic conversations? Like what role is humor having?
Always. Because
Okay.
people need to see that you're still human. It adds to your credibility and that you have a certain objectivity. You can't be funny unless you can step outside the boundaries of the normal. So humor is important. It lightens the mood and it also conveys messages.
Okay. Last 4 questions, sir. What is the most bizarre request a foreign leader or government official has ever made of you?
Well, I've had a head of state actually saying he wanted to meet his old girlfriend and could I arrange that for him on a state visit.
Wow. Well, I'll let the listeners try to guess whoever. What would you tell your grandchildren about, and that generation, about being globally aware citizens?
I'd say read as much as you can, but always keep an open mind.
Okay. And this last one, and you can only choose one in this, okay? What is your favorite book and movie? And you can only choose one book and one movie.
The one that started me on IR was EHK's 20-Year Crisis.
Okay. And
the one I really enjoyed was Wag the Dog, which is about soft power and a fake war. If you get a chance, take a look at it.
yeah, I'm going to watch it right after this now, Wag the Dog.
I don't know where you'd find it, though. It's an old movie.
I'll look for it. And
it's
the
an
last
movie.
Right. And the last question, and this is the closing question that I have on this podcast. If you had access to billboards across the world for a day, what is one message that you would put up there?
Get real.
That hits hard. Get real. Okay, cool. All right. Professor, thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Ishan. Thank you. Enjoyed that.